So we're going to be talking about the 13 basic steps you need in order to start a vegetable garden. So one of the first things when you're planning on starting your vegetable garden is picking the crops that you're going to be planting. And I know that sounds really basic and simple, but it's going to vary from person to person. So you want to be looking at what your family eats on a regular basis, what you guys like, as well as what is going to grow well in your area, which leads me to tip number 2. And that is knowing your first and last average frost date, and ideally what your average summer temperatures are. Most gardeners, when they're starting to grow a garden, will grow a summer vegetable garden. So knowing what your average summer temperatures are is really going to help you know what types of crops are going to grow well in your area. Because if you have really hot, dry summers, then you're not going to be able to grow any type of cool weather crop. Like here I've got broccoli and cauliflower next to me, but if you try to grow that in the middle of summer when temps are 85 degrees on up into the 90s and 100s, it's not going to produce, it's going to bolt, and it's not going to do very well for you. So knowing your environment and your climate is really key in having a successful vegetable garden. And that first and last frost date is also going to let you know when you are going to be planting your different crops. Now, if you're wondering, well, great, I'm going to find out which crops I'm going to be growing and what I want to be growing, and knowing my first and last average frost date is going to allow me to know when to plant them. You may be wondering, how much do I need to plant of everything in order to feed my family? So I have got another video and some free charts on how much to plant of each crop per person, as well as some worksheets that will walk you through all of those steps. So I'll link to that below, and you can also click on the card and go and find those out. Now, after you have went through those, the third step is picking your garden location. So if you have my book, The Family Garden Plan, or you've went through my gardening course, you know all about micro and macro climates. But some good rules of thumb when you're picking your garden location is you want to know where the sun is going to be coming from and how many hours of sunlight that area gets. So most of your vegetables and fruit are going to need at least 6+ hours of direct sunlight in order to produce a good crop for you. So no matter what time of year, you want to be looking and seeing how many hours, and of course in the summertime, any area is going to get more sun than it would in the winter time. And especially where we live right now, I'm recording this in the winter, and the sun barely gets up over our mountain ranges. But in the middle of summer, that sun will be almost overhead, so it'll be a lot more direct sunlight and a lot more sunlight that I'm getting. Some other things to take into consideration is when you're putting in your garden spot, not only is it getting a decent amount of sunlight and direct sunlight, but is it close to an area for water? So regardless of what watering system you pick, which we'll be going over that, you want to make sure that you're not having to run miles and miles of hose, that there is water nearby, or if you're packing it by hand, that you don't have to pack it too far. Some other things to keep in mind is when that sun is up in the summertime, are there any trees or building that may not be leafed out now but would be leafed out in the summertime that then would cause that area to be in a lot of shade? So you definitely want to look at that. Some other things are to consider. If you're on the north side, so you have more yard, it's on the north side of your house, it's likely that north side is not going to get as much sun and it's going to be colder. Now that could be beneficial if you live in a really hot climate, but if you live in a cooler climate like I do, I don't grow hardly anything on the northern part of our property that's in front of our house. Now this garden spot is actually on the west side and it's south facing. So I get the sun all day long as well as the setting sun, and this works perfectly for us. Some other considerations would be the east if you get a lot of the morning sun. The reason I picked the west south-facing portion for our property is because we have a lot of trees and a taller mountain range that's on the east, and that blocks the morning sun from getting to it. So you just really want to take into those considerations. You also want to look when you're picking your location, is it an area that's low and has a lot of standing water when it rains really hard? Is it an area that gets a lot of drain off? Because you don't want your vegetable garden to be in an area that has a lot of standing water. You want the soil to be well draining. The next thing you want to consider is what type of garden beds are you going to be putting in? So right now I am standing in our largest in-ground gardening area. So obviously we're just planting right into the ground. That's what the gardening bed is. Some other options though, of course, are raised beds, and that's where you have the ground, it goes straight to the ground, so it's not a container, but you've got it raised up. Usually they'll have sides on them. It can be with rock, it can be with wood, it can be with metal. There's all different types of things that you can do, but you have it filled with soil and it's raised up off of the ground. There's some pros and cons to raised beds. If you have a really compact or very poor soil, raised beds are great because you can bring in some good topsoil and some good compost and have those go in there. And so it can really help with poor draining or poor soil. The ground in a raised bed, because it's elevated, will heat up faster in the springtime. So that can be good if you can get a jump on some of the planting for some of those seeds and plants that require warmer soil. The raised bed will provide that opportunity. However, then on the flip side though, in the middle of summertime, they're going to be hotter and they will dry out faster. So if you live in an area where you struggle with that, it might not be an ideal option. And then there's usually the cost of bringing in that soil as well. But a lot of people like raised beds because they are up higher, and so they don't have to bend down as far or squat down. So if you have issues with that and mobility, they can also be a great option for that as well. We don't have raised beds here simply because I have really good fertile natural soil and it's well draining, and so I just go ahead and go right into the ground. But raised beds can be a really good benefit. Some other things to think about that also work well in raised beds or an in-ground gardening bed like we have here is to put in some vertical options. So this allows me to grow more in one space, and I've seen where people will have raised beds and they'll have a raised bed with a row in between, and they will take these vertical options and they'll have it go from one raised bed to the other so that they're actually growing over the walkway, and that would just be space that wouldn't be being used if they didn't have a vertical option. So don't be afraid to get a little bit creative and use a lot of different options. I know I use the vertical, the in-ground, as well as container gardening, and you can even get really creative, check this out, with your containers. So container gardening can be really great, and you can actually combine container gardening with doing it vertically. So this is a green stalk vertical planter. I love this. I've got my strawberries in here, and you can see that this I have nestled against the side of the house. So this is the southern exposure of our home. And what's great about this is I can move this container. So this is a more protected area. It gets the heat whenever we do have sun. This absorbs it and put it back to this. It helps to protect it. So for my perennial plants like this, for my strawberries, this keeps them warmer and offers them some protection because it is above ground. And that can be one of the cons of doing containers as well as raised beds, but more so with containers is for things like perennial plants when it gets really cold out, it doesn't have the protection of being down in the ground, and so this is more exposed to temperatures and ice, and so it can be damaging. But it's great because this is movable. It's on wheels, but I did have to pack it because obviously it's not going to wheel over this type of ground. And so for the winter, this is where I keep this planter, and then in the summer, I move it back out into an area that's not right up against the house, so it's not so hot and it's amongst the other flowers. Now, if you're curious about this system, it actually has one more tier that will stock on top that I just have empty right now because I usually have my basil and annuals in there. You can get a coupon code, and I've got that in the video description, so you can get a coupon code if you are curious about getting one of these. But I've had these strawberries in here for over a year, and I really like this system. The pockets are deep enough though that you can even grow carrots. They do great with beans. You can put, I haven't done tomatoes in them, but I've seen other people have done tomatoes in them. But you can really grow a large variety of different plants in this system. So next we got to talk, and that is your soil. So the soil is the most important part really of any garden, because usually when there's issues with plants, it always comes down to an issue with the soil. So this is a garden bed that was just lawn that we just put in last year. So if you're curious about how to turn an area of lawn into a garden bed, you can go and check out that video and I walk you through those steps. So one of the things that I recommend, especially, I don't do it every year, but I like to do it if it's a new bed or if we've had a lot of crops in that area for a couple of different growing seasons, and that's a soil test. Soil tests are very easy to do. Most county extension offices will do them for free, if not for just a few dollars. I happen to live in one of the only counties in the US that does not provide soil tests, and so I use a local lab. It's like $19 for the expansive soil test that tells me all kinds of different micro and macronutrient levels. But I highly recommend that because it's going to let you know from the get-go what levels may be lacking or may be too high. And if you do need to amend your soil, exactly how much of specific amendments you need to put into the soil. Because it's kind of like Goldilocks and the Three Bears with most of your soil levels, especially with things like nitrogen. You have too little, you're not going to get good growth. The plants are going to look sickly, they'll often be yellow, they just won't be very robust. But if you have too much nitrogen, you can burn the roots of the plant. If it's things like tomatoes that are leafy, you'll have a lot of leaf vegetation, but you won't have a lot of blossoms and actually fruit. So again, it's kind of like too little's not a good thing. Too much is also not a good thing. You want to be right in the middle, and a soil test will let you know exactly how much you need to put on to get your levels fixed. Now, the next tip I have beyond just the soil test is building up good soil. So there are some visual keys, and I actually have a post that goes much more in depth onto amending your soil and doing soil tests and those macro and micronutrient levels. But you can kind of look at soil, and if it is really red or really gray or sandy in color or sandy in feel, then you know it's going to need some added nutrients to it. The darker it is, like the closer to black or really dark brown, then it's going to have more of those nutrients in there, and you can just tell that it's more fertile soil. So one of the things that I feel like you can't go wrong with is using compost as well as aged manure. Now, never fresh manure unless it is rabbit, because fresh, especially steer manure or chicken manure, is really high in nitrogen, and if you use it fresh, the levels will be too high, and again, it can burn the roots of your plants and actually cause some harm. So you always want to make sure that that is not, it's aged and composted down, but then just regular compost works too. We've got a couple different compost areas that we have. I've got a tumbler that is going right there, but of course I'm limited to the size of that when I'm using that. And then we also have some piles actually out in the field where most of the manure is, out in the pasture, that I will mix with some of that sawdust and create just large compost piles with the tractor. And then we put those on in the fall and spring here in the garden. You can also do sheet mulching and layering, where you just layer compost in the fall and in the winter, and you create those layers that will create compost. I should say it's not compost yet, where you're doing like shredded leaves and different things like that. I've got several resources that I'll link to beneath this video that you can check those out. Now, you can get and have a lot of different tools, but you really only need a few basic tools to get started with your garden. Now, if you don't have any type of prepared bed, you're probably going to need a rototiller, and that can be a big expense up front. You can see what I used. I have a BCS tractor that we use to do this, but you can also rent rototillers, or if you have a neighbor with a tractor, we've done that in the past before we got our own. So there are ways without actually purchasing a rototiller that you can have a new bed, in-ground bed put in. But after that, really just some basic tools. A shovel is great to have, this pointed shovel. I use this quite a bit, especially if I'm like digging out like plants here, like these actually have a decent root system. So I can use the shovel just to get that up and to get those out. When it's smaller weeds and we've just planted it in between plants, especially younger seedlings, a hoe works really great. I probably use the hoe the most, especially in the summertime. And there's other tools that people like to have, but honestly, as far as the actual vegetable garden comes in, these are the ones that I use the most, and especially the hoe. Tip number 8 is seeds and seed starting. So first off, you've decided which crops you're going to grow, but then you actually need to decide, are you going to be taking the seeds and direct sowing them into the ground? So direct sowing is where it's as easy and as simple as it sounds. You're just literally taking the seed and you are planting it straight into the dirt or the container where it's going to grow if you're doing container plants or raised beds. Now, seed starting is where you will be starting the seeds in the house or a greenhouse. I don't have a greenhouse, so I seed start all my seeds in the house. And you can watch the video that I have on that, on how I seed start my tomato seeds if you want to see step by step. I do a combination of both. So for my tomato seeds and my peppers, I seed start those in the house. So I've got my tomatoes here as well as my peppers. And almost everything else I do a direct sowing. So tip number 9 is you can do transplants, which you can either seed start yourself to have the transplants, or you may decide to buy those transplants, the young little seedlings that they're already a baby plant, from a local nursery or gardening store. One of the drawbacks on doing that is you're limited to whatever plant varieties that the nursery or the gardening store has decided to plant. And I might be a little bit of a control freak, and so I prefer to seed start so that I get the exact varieties that I want. So there is a little more work involved, of course, with doing your seed starting, but I think it's well worth it, especially because I do all heirloom seeds so that I can seed save. And of course, I don't seed save everything. I do still buy some seeds, but you can see I've got bean seed here that my family's been seed saving for over 100 years. And that's the only way that I have this bean seed. So I only plant our bean seed. I seed save carrots. I seed save a variety of things, but I still also like to buy different varieties and try out new things. But I always purchase heirlooms, so if I want to seed save that item, then I have that option. If you're curious on where to buy heirloom seeds, I have a blog post I'll link to so that you can go and check out all of my favorite resources and companies that I like to buy from for all of our seeds. Now, we've went over if we're going to be direct sowing our seeds, making sure we have our seeds, and if you decide to seed start or if you're going to get transplants. And that leads me to the next tip, and that is when you are transplanting your plants into the garden. So you want to make sure that you are hardening off those transplants, even if you buy them from a local nursery. Oftentimes when you buy them from a local nursery and then you bring them home, it is a different growing environment, and some of the nurseries have the plants inside where they're not getting as cold at night, etc. And it's just always a good idea. So what I mean by hardening off, and it could be your own transplants if you're starting those seeds indoors, is you start for just a couple of hours a day the first day, setting them outside, and then you bring them back in. And then each day you lengthen the amount of time by a couple of hours that the plant is outdoors. And so then after about a week, then you can leave them outside and they're going to be fine. But you don't want to shock them. And that's the big thing that we're after, is we don't want to take them from one very controlled environment to a very different environment, because a lot of times they'll go into shock and then they'll actually die. So we're just doing a gentle transition period. Tip number 10 is the proper planting time. And that also is going to help you with your seed starting as well. And the proper planting time is why I said you need to know your first and last average frost dates as well as average temperatures where you live. Because you've got cool weather plants that can handle cooler temperatures, right? Makes sense there. And maybe even frost tolerant, which means you can plant them out earlier. Then you have warm weather plants that will not tolerate any type of freezing temps or temperatures even down into the 30s, and don't even really do very well when temps are down into the 40s. And so you want to make sure that you're getting those planted at the proper time so that they stay nice and warm. You also want to know the proper planting time for each crop, because if you are going to be seed starting indoors that plant, then you need to be able to calculate backwards from in the springtime, the last average frost date, and count backwards so that you have started it indoors so that it's at a large enough plant size to plant out outside when the proper time is there. So knowing those dates and making sure you're planting those plants when it's the ideal conditions, and even direct sowing. Some seeds you can direct sow, those cool weather things like beets and peas and onions, you can put those out when it's much cooler than you would be able to a bean plant or a cucumber plant. It would need to be a lot warmer. So it's true on knowing that proper planting time for both direct sowing as well as your seedlings and transplants. So number 11 on our tips is watering options. You are likely going to have to do some watering at one point or another, and there's lots of different options. So this is my high tunnel where I grow all of my tomatoes and pepper plants. And so I just leave my soaker hose here in the high tunnel, and I just will hook back up to this bad boy when I get the tomatoes planted, which will be in May. So soaker hoses are great because, hence the name soaker hose, it takes a little amount of water and it just seeps out. It doesn't get any water actually on the leaves of the plant, just down into the ground. So that can be great if you have plants and you have a lot of overhead moisture where fungal disease like downy mildew, powdery mildew, or blight. This can help with your disease control a lot, and it also really soaks the soil, which is really great if you have harder or compact soil or areas that are really dry. This really gets down into the roots. So I really like my soaker hoses. But there's lots of different options. But again, that tip of picking your garden location next to a water source is really going to be key, because I'm still having to run my main hose to that soaker hose to get water, obviously, to the soaker hose. So this is obviously at the end of our house. So I've got my spigot here. And so I can run this hose right to the high tunnel for the soaker hose. And then we also have a sprinkler that's in the middle of this garden. And so I can just run the hose and hook it up to that overhead sprinkler that's on that middle post. And then it'll turn and oscillate and get the entire garden. There are a few plants that I do water by hand, and right now I'm not going to turn the whole soaker hose on for just a few lettuce plants, but I do have some lettuce that I grow year-round inside the high tunnel. And so because this is covered, it's obviously not getting the rain, even though we almost have rain every day. We're actually just now getting a sun break. It was pouring earlier. And so I'll come in here and water these guys. So you can see I've got my lettuce here. But I wouldn't want to have my watering source very far away unless I really enjoy packing, you know, a few gallons of water at a time all over Timbuktu and back. So number 12 is weed control. Most people don't like to spend a ton of their time in the garden on weeding, though it is a necessity, but you definitely have options. So one of the options is to put down some type of mulch to help keep the weeds at bay. So here I have down where we put down a layer of cardboard, and then we covered that with a couple inches of wood chips. And you can see that this is starting to break down. So whenever you're doing mulching in your layers like this, it is something that is going to be a yearly maintenance, like you're going to have to add more to it. Now, there are a few weeds that do come up through it. You can actually see, I did a video on where we covered half of our garden in wood chips and what that looked like 18 months later as far as weeds and what I thought about it and that whole system. So you can go and watch that video for more in-depth details. But doing some type of mulch will help with the weeds. And if you've got bare ground, then, which we do still have bare ground, I don't have the entire garden mulched yet. Of course, right now in the winter time, there's not a ton of weeds that are popping up. But as we move into more of the spring and the summer months, then this is going to require either with a hoe when they're small or using a tiller to chop those weeds up and put them back in, or just sitting there and doing it by hand, which is my least favorite, is pulling weeds by hand. But you definitely want to have some type of a system down for weed management. I have a video on the different ways that we do the weed control that you can see that more in depth as well, and I'll link to that so you can go and check that out. Now, we've covered almost everything, and step number 13, or tip number 13, I should say, which is one of my favorites, is actually getting to the harvest. Even here in the middle of winter, the time of this I'm recording this, it is the end, almost the end of January, we have got Brussels sprouts. So I can come out and harvest these for dinner. They will stay just fine out here. They do great even through the cold. And I've got some larger ones down here, some small ones that are still forming. And I've got some little carrots through here, and we also have, as you saw, I've got lettuce growing, and I still have kale, and the potatoes are not still growing, but they are still being stored in the ground, so I can come and dig those up. And there's nothing more rewarding. The most rewarding part of the garden is coming out and getting to harvest and eat the fresh vegetables that you grew yourself. If you want to know more about how much to plant per person and planning a year's worth of food for your family with your garden, go and check out this video.